We're going to go
Okay, so
ahead and
one
get
was more
started.
professional, or one is more
Let's start by just going around and introducing ourselves. I know that folks have already started introducing yourselves to each other. So I'm Nelson Graff, University Reading Program Director, pretty brand new. So today we're talking about teaching students to uncover assumptions and perspectives. As you know, teaching them to uncover assumptions is all about teaching close reading. But it's particular kinds of close reading and particular ways of close reading. And any time that we're teaching students strategies like this, it involves scaffolding, so either providing them supports or moving from familiar and simple to unfamiliar and complex. And so we're going to do a little play today with some of that, and we'll see how that goes. So we're going to start with something called an opinionaire. And what I'm going to ask you to do is there are 5 statements. And in the first column, it says you. So what I'd like you to do is for each of those 5 statements, indicate in the first column whether you A, agree, or D, disagree. And you can't fail to choose.
I'm back.
For the moment, we're not going to talk about your opinions about these statements. But I do want to ask you what the statements are. What kinds of statements are they? Robin, you have an answer on your face.
How you define the terms is everything. How you define coercion, how you define free speech. If you don't have a sense of these concepts, either a public or personal view, it's hard to understand.
But how would you describe the statement collective action inhibits individual freedom?
So polarizing.
Okay, it's polarizing.
It depends.
They're
That's high.
really directed. They're written with a certain opinion
Okay.
in place. There isn't.
That's right.
I was saying, you could put collective action could inhibit. There's no room for any other.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very.
Well, they're absolutes. You don't
They're
have that.
absolutes.
They said you
Yeah.
have to agree or disagree.
And so one of the things that you get to do with an activity like this is before students get into a reading, you get to highlight some of the questions or assumptions that might be behind a reading for students to, and this is scaffolding because you're already identifying some of the assumptions. You're not asking them to dig them out. You're asking them to position themselves in terms of some implicit assumptions or explicit assumptions before getting to a reading. So that way they are primed when they read to see those assumptions in the reading or to see the authors follow with assumptions. So this kind of activity, and you'll notice there are also columns for the authors. But what this kind of activity does is it primes students. Right? It already shapes their reading in the sense that it highlights certain assumptions. So this is a kind of scaffolding because you're identifying assumptions, you're framing them very explicitly, and asking students to think about them first. So now, I'm going to hand you an article. This is an editorial. From the Wall Street Journal. And the first thing I'd like you to do is just read through it. And once you've read through it, would you please try to answer those same questions, those same statements for the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal? What would they say to each of those statements? First, I want to ask for general impressions of the editorial.
I guess as an editorial should be, it's very opinionated.
Mhm. What makes you say that?
Judge Scalia was a giant. Defenders of liberty, that opportunity may now be lost. Many other things. Some of us.
Some of us bad mistakes,
Bad
bad
mistakes,
mistakes.
So, what would you say the editorial board believes about collective action inhibits individual freedom? Do they agree or disagree?
Agree.
So most of you said agree. Why do you say that?
Because I don't believe the teacher should have to pay, and especially not without having the right to say how to be spent.
Okay. Anything else highlight their agreement for you?
The word fees being in quotation marks.
I'm sorry?
The word fees being in quotation marks.
Okay. Ryan, did you, were you looking up to say something?
Oh, well, I think that there's maybe a bit of a paradox here in the sense that they are unashamedly saying that Republicans want voters to first have a say in the presidential election, which is not an established thing. There's a president in office who has the power to appoint Supreme Court justices, and that's not really contested in a legal sense, so they're politicizing this issue and suggesting that roughly half of the electorate should have their say in this particular way if their position to be politically influential come fall. So therefore, that seems contrary to the first one.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And that's what's very important about what you just said is that nobody's pure about any of these assumptions. And so recognizing that, I think, is very useful. How about all who benefit from an activity should pay for it? Do they agree or disagree?
Disagree.
Does anyone think they agree? Or does anyone think it's questionable?
I put A and E, because at first I thought it wasn't questionable, but then later I thought, well, maybe it is. So.
Why?
She's figuring that out. I think that I put D because that was the most obvious response to me, because I thought in this case, that they don't believe that people should pay these fees, even if they might benefit from that collective action by something like a pay increase. So I think at least in a large sense, that seems like a good reason to put a D, but I don't know if there's some other contradiction. I think I'd have to look at it a little more closely.
There is the assumption that in the line, force public employees to pay fees, even if they choose not to join. In other words, you should get what you pay for, therefore, you should have services that come through payment. And so you could, if you thought about it, and I did the same, I quickly put disagree, but it is, they are implying that you pay for services. And therefore, you might say, everyone must benefit from what folks pay. So you could say they agree.
Okay.
That's what I put. I put agree, and I put it based on kind of actually the abstract, which said, because they're making the point that, Judge Scalia was a giant in protecting First Amendment rights. So there's an assumption there that that's the perspective of the editor. That is my reason for seeing it.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. It's like if you directly get the service, then you should pay for it.
Right.
If you don't, if you choose not to, you should have the choice not to pay for it.
Yeah,
So
that
it's
was-
kind of, so I think actually that makes sense.
That was
But,
my-
but then the
yeah.
question is, do they benefit from unions? I mean,
Right.
the argument for
Yeah.
paying for unions is that they benefit from it.
Right,
But it also assumes a definition of benefit,
that's right, yeah.
right?
I think they don't directly address collective bargaining agreements and how they function in detail, so I think there's maybe not quite enough information for us to know for sure, but they seem to be in the forced to choose, I think they just do.
How about the choice of how to spend one's money as a free speech issue?
I don't know what I thought it was answered.
Because that's lined up with Justice Scott.
Yeah, I think I think they overtly state that. How about government coercion is wrong? Why do you say A?
I suppose it depends on which branch of the government, because they seem to think that the Supreme Court, as a judicial branch, is well within its purview to mandate certain things.
Okay, interesting point.
But they don't believe the president is.
Well, and I think that you can make the argument when they say that it's negative that unions can force employees to pay and that there's coercion involved, that they agree that government coercion is wrong. But your point that the Supreme Court, but I guess the question is, are they seeing the Supreme Court as coercing people, or are they seeing the Supreme Court as ruling on whether or not the coercion is legitimate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even in overturning bad Supreme Court
Right.
mistakes.
And how about the Supreme Court as a political entity? Yes.
It seemed to be quite clear on that, and saying that acknowledging that it is, and its composition can be influenced by political processes like during the presidential election.
So how did thinking about this article in terms of these assumptions either help you or inhibit your reading? Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that one thing that I thought was interesting is, because I was looking at my initial reactions to these, and then I'm looking at I disagree with this editorial, but it's interesting to see that some of my answers are the same as what I assumed. So then I started thinking about that and going, okay, so what's happening there? And so I thought, okay, but for different reasons. Right? So that was interesting to notice that pattern.
And so there are two pieces here that I want to highlight about where we are beginning. One is that we're beginning with an editorial. And we're beginning with an editorial because there is an overt purpose to persuade. There is an overt opinion. It's always easier to identify assumptions when someone is overtly making a case. The second thing that I want to highlight is that I made an assumption that most of you would disagree with this editorial. And it's generally easier to identify assumptions with which we disagree than assumptions with which we agree. So now I want to build on this a little bit and elaborate our thinking about assumptions with some more focused questions that help to guide the close reading process. And the first question is actually probably the hardest for our students. The first question is, what does the author identify as at issue? Look at the title and look at how they begin. When you're dealing with something like this, that's going to be difficult for students, I recommend first doing it all together or modeling it for them. It would be very easy for students to jump to the conclusion that this editorial is about unions. Why do I say it's not about unions? Right?
Well, it has a lot to do with political power and policy,
Okay.
which is,
Can you point us to what makes you say that?
there's the sentence about the incrementalist approach advocated by Chief Justice John Roberts and how that requires a center-right majority in
Okay.
the Supreme Court. And a concern that approach to creating laws will be lost if there's not a certain person.
Okay. Andina, you gonna?
So I was trying to figure out what we're doing here.
Right, we're trying to
We're
answer
still
the
looking
first
at this,
question.
but
We're looking at,
this
yeah,
article. Okay,
we're still looking at that
looking for another
editorial.
article.
And the question I'm asking is, what does the author identify as at issue?
Well, free speech.
And I'm saying it's not about unions.
No, about the free speech and stuff.
Or who's going to replace the judge?
Uh-huh.
And how important that is.
Where'd you look?
I think it's about the balance of political affiliation with the Supreme Court.
Why do you say that?
Because it's a point that I think the author keeps returning to, and the unions are an illustration or an example of this point. And I suppose the other thing is when he's, or she,
Well, it's they, because it's the editorial board.
oh, when they say something like, with Justice Scalia's death, such a majority will be lost for years or decades. There seems to be a long-term concern,
Mhm.
whether it's about unions or other kinds of conservative issues, that there won't be the kind of emphasis on the Supreme Court that Justice Scalia brought.
But I want to highlight something that's very important that you said that students are likely to miss. You said that the unions are an example of something. And where do you see that? What makes you say that the unions are an example of something rather than the issue?
The very first line.
Yes. And this is important, to look at titles and look at first lines as to what an author identifies as the exigence, as the problem that they're addressing. And when they say, Tuesday showed how acutely Justice Scalia will be missed, they're emphasizing, they're not talking about the ruling, they're using the ruling to talk about how acutely Scalia will be missed and why. Right?
Which they mentioned in the final sentence as well.
They do, yes. And so good. The conclusions, the ends, are also good places to
Yeah,
look.
exactly.
But I think that we've all had the experience of having students read something like this and miss the point because they think that the issue is what the bulk of the article talks about, even though the bulk of the article talks about it in a way that frames it around some other issue. And so helping students see where authors identify what's at issue is crucial if we're going to help them identify assumptions. And we'll see when we look at another perspective on this, that the same topic, the same event can inspire an article, an editorial that frames a different issue. I'll just hand this out. We aren't going to really go over it, except briefly. But one way to think about the issue is in terms of something that rhetoricians call stasis theory. And stasis is basically, or stasis, is basically the balance, the point at which there is disagreement. And very often, well, let me ask, how many of you have found that you are disagreeing with someone, and it's only after extended discussion that you realize that you're actually talking about two different things? All right? What's happening there is that you're out of stasis. You haven't agreed on the question that you're debating before getting into an argument. Getting students to take a step back and ask, what is at issue, is the first step to helping them analyze and get at assumptions. Because there's an assumption involved in deciding that something's at issue in any given instance. So for the Wall Street Journal editors, what is at issue is free speech and the balance of the Supreme Court. So we're going to continue with this article, and let me ask you to look through the article and consider, what does the author highlight as valuable? And you can think about this both explicitly and implicitly. Consider what the author highlights as important, critical, under attack, worth defending, or implicitly, what language is loaded that suggests something about values. So take a couple minutes in pairs and look at the article in terms of, because we now have an even number, look at the article in terms of values. I know that you could keep going with this, but I'm going to stop and ask what this reveals to you. What looking in terms of the values they name and the values they imply helps you see. And so Robin and Jimena asked, when you talk about loaded language, isn't that already explicitly naming values? And that's a question. When I did this, I was thinking that there are values that they name, right? They say liberty, they say freedom, But then there are values that they imply when they say force, when they say coercion. And so that's the distinction that I was making. But you may not want to make the distinction in that way. The idea is to help students pull out what the values are that are highlighted. Now I'm going to ask, we move to the second question, whose perspectives matter? Whom does the author cite as an authority? Whose perspectives are represented? And then, whom else does the issue involve? Who else might have some perspective on the matter who isn't named or cited? What might that person say? So take just a couple minutes to start looking at this. And remember, sorry, let me just pause before you, remember that when you think about who's not named, you're focusing on what they have defined as the issue, not something that might be the content but not the issue. Right? So in other words, it wouldn't make sense if the issue is freedom of speech and the Supreme Court, it wouldn't necessarily make sense for them to cite pro-union people, because that's not how they define the issue.
They did.
I'm sorry?
But they did at the end. Union leaders certainly understand.
Oh, union leaders certainly understand, judging by that. Okay, great. So they did cite union leaders, but did they cite union leaders about this decision?
No.
Right? So that's,
Well, I think they imply that. Isn't it kind of implicit in that if they want Merrick Garland, they think he would vote for what they're trying to do with dues?
right, but it's not about this particular decision. It's about their long-term agenda.
Yeah.
I think they're not addressing the counter arguments.
Okay.
So they're not,
So
so
who were they
what
not?
is that, you know?
Yeah, so let's actually, just because this will be quicker, let's talk about it together. Whom do they cite? They do cite union leaders.
The Supreme Court,
I'm sorry?
the Supreme Court.
They do cite the Supreme Court.
Scalia.
They do cite Scalia.
Center for Individual Rights.
The Center for Individual Rights. Implicitly, they cite Alito.
And Roberts.
And Roberts. So who else? Go ahead.
I suppose if we were just answering the question whose perspectives matter, we thought their claim was the perspectives of the center-right majority as they had identified.
But how can you tell that?
That's just a claim. I think in this
But
case, and
but
also-
you that's an inference you drew. Why did you draw that inference?
Because they,
I think it's in a sentence, but incrementalization requires a continuing center-right majority.
Okay.
true, and then it follows it up with, this is why Republicans want voters to have a say, so.
So they also cite Republicans. But I think the point is that they cite Scalia, they cite Roberts, they cite Alito, they cite Republicans.
Not
So
really.
all of that is
Conservative.
how you can make that implicit claim,
Conservative.
right? Who else might have an opinion on this who isn't cited?
Yeah, or justices.
All right.
Or
There are-
liberal,
yeah,
or
The liberal
or
justices aren't cited.
Right.
Who else isn't cited?
Well, our president is
Yeah.
not directly cited.
The president isn't cited. Democrats aren't cited.
Democrats are cited a little as Merrick Garland is the Democratic.
Okay, fair enough.
But still not overtly, certainly.
You notice that there are no constitutional scholars cited? No Supreme Court, no scholars of the Supreme Court are cited. So all of that is important. When you notice who is and isn't cited, that helps you to identify a perspective.
I was also thinking all of this is kind of getting off of the Supreme Court focus, but, union members, I can see kind of that, this.
Right, and that's and that's why I said the make sure you're talking about what they've said is at issue,
Yeah.
because it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for them
Yeah,
to.
the center of-
It mentions public school teachers once,
Yeah, good point.
but they're really kind of left out of it. It's unions and dues and government and First Amendment. But the core group that the whole suit's based on.
But notice it's also only the public school teachers who object
Right.
are the ones who are cited,
Mhm.
not the public school teachers who support.
This is
But
going to
even
make
the ones-
reading anything really difficult from now on.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Much more involved.
But if we're teaching students to understand the perspectives that they're reading, this is part of the process that we're helping them go through. And notice that these questions and these tables are scaffolding, right? We're modeling for students the kinds of questions to ask themselves and giving them a structure in which to, and guidance with which to consider those questions. Ultimately, we want them to be able to do this on their own. And so we want to be able to take away the scaffolding. But for now, the handout like this helps to model and helps to mentor students. Most of our students, our undergraduates, would not have the background knowledge to do all of this. And so that again highlights the need for thinking about your audience. What do they have enough background information about to practice this so that you can then build up to, and that's where I say start with the familiar. I figured in a group like this, talking about unions, talking about the constitutional issues,
Yeah, good audience.
that's fine. But with most undergraduates,
I was just going to say on that point, next week my students are going to be having a dialogue. Not so much, I'm trying to not do it as a debate.
yeah,
About whether students should be involved in campus sustainability action. And so the nice thing about that conversation is they have plenty to say
right,
and plenty of context to have that conversation, so
yeah.
it's helpful.
And that's, but one of the things you can even do with them is you can give them something like this to take notes on other positions, to take notes on what other people say. What are the values, explicit and implicit, in what someone else has said? What have they defined as the issue? Do they define the issue as student freedom? Do they define the issue as sustainability? So, even in that kind of conversation,
Yes.
they can use this to identify what's going on and to look for assumptions that they can. So, one thing.
That's what I was thinking,
Great.
is that they're starting with the familiar, so
Yeah.
then they can use some of these tools and have an
Exactly.
easier time doing so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Angela?
Yeah, I was wondering, so what happens when you find students unable to extract what it is that you hope they would get out of it? Do you offer examples, and does that usually help? Do you just wait until somebody says something?
It depends.
That's gonna be a good moment in your video.
should be modeling. So one possibility is that if you get into a situation in which students don't have the background knowledge, you make what is going on the topic of conversation. In other words, if students are not coming up with what you expect them to come up with, one thing you can do is say, what's going on? Why don't you have an opinion about this? What is it that you need to know that you don't know in order to identify? So you can use it as an opportunity for metacognition. Another possibility is that you say, all right, I'm going to model this for you. And you think aloud your process of making sense of it. And then you go back to the metacognitive. What did I do that you weren't prepared to do? Or what did you notice that I did? How might you do that? Or what do you need in order to do that yourself? So I think that we undersell difficulty and confusion as valuable in our classes. And by making those moments to interrogate, we really offer students a narrative that says difficulty is something to learn from, not something to avoid. And when we answer our own questions rather than plumbing the difficulty of it, we hint to students, we suggest to students that difficulty is something to avoid. It's uncomfortable, therefore we should get past it. Tiffany, I'm seeing the look on your face that I'm not sure I...
No, that's fine. I agree with that.
Okay.
Well, I would say my only caveat to what you're saying is that sometimes you'll have a couple students in the class who will actually see it, and then they take over. And I don't want that to happen, because I want everyone to think for themselves. So my approach to that situation is I ask them to work one-on-one with someone sitting next to them, and then give them a few scaffolds to think through. All right, and then, have their partners come back to the class, because then I've got everybody engaged, or even sometimes throw out a couple of questions that would be like yes, no, give me a thumbs up, something like, just so I can test the water and make sure that I'm getting equitable interaction, as opposed to the few people who can see it and the rest just over their head. So that's my approach.
And one of the things to do if you do have a few people who see it is to make sure to ask them why. How do you see it? What did you do?
It's not so much the opinion, it's
Right.
the construct.
Right.
They get
Did
through
you
that.
really look at everything?
Yes.
And so everybody has an opinion, but have they really understood what it's based on?
Yeah,
That's the value of the whole thing, not really even the outcome.
exactly.
Nelson, you do that all the time. Your question is always, what do you see?
Right.
What made you think that?
Yeah.
And that's a really nice model.
So if we look at question 4, and this is a challenging one for students, what does the author highlight as normal? So look especially for the use of should or must, or look for statements about what is missing, what is not happening. Because very often I ask students to do observations, and when they write up their observations, they write about things that aren't there. The teacher never responded to this student's question, or the teacher didn't do this. And what I highlight for them is, when you do that, you are no longer observing, you're interpreting. Because to say that something isn't happening is to assume that it should be happening. And so that's an important place to look for what is normal, what's normative in a piece. So what do we see that's normal or normative in this piece? Go ahead, Rebecca.
I was just going to say, I think a conservative Supreme Court, certainly right of the center is normal.
Okay. And what makes you say that?
Well, because there are 9 members, there are trying to do everything it can to make sure that a member that was considered one of the most conservative, that no one center would replace him, but it would be someone that would be in that same position.
Show me the language in
Or
the
show you
text.
the language, yeah, so.
I think
Yeah, go ahead.
Ardith, go ahead.
No,
that,
please.
that increment, the second paragraph on the second page
Uh-huh.
of that, with the continuing center-right majority, such majority will be lost if the Democratic nominee is confirmed.
Mhm. Tiffany, do you?
Yeah. They're assuming that if it's a Republican, then that person would continue incrementalism rather than a Democratic nominee.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
thought it explicitly looks for, there is always dissension among the court.
Mhm.
So right now it has this slant, but there's always dissension.
Okay, that's certainly normal, right? What do you make of the fact that they say Tuesday's ruling creates no precedent?
It's a pass.
Well, notice this is a negation.
There's still opportunity.
Yes, but the negation assumes something would happen, right? That a Supreme Court ruling would create a precedent. So the fact that they highlight that says the normal is for it to create a precedent.
To be overturned.
And then they say it's a good thing that it didn't. It's a good thing this is unusual. But you have to notice what they say is normal in order to notice that. Right?
Well, I think part of what you just mentioned is that they, in speaking to their audiences, they understand Wall Street Journal readers would like the conversation to be about center-right versus activist right, and mentioning that Alito would have liked to have made this reversal, but John Roberts, a center-right person on the court, preferred the incrementalist approach. So we'll work with what we have. Let's keep pushing at least for the incrementalist approach, but as we see opportunities, let's do things that are in line with the sort of political agenda. That was what I was getting from the middle.
Well, and notice the normalcy implied by center-right. All right? For many of us liberals, the folks who are right-wing on the court are crazy radical right, but the Wall Street Journal is defining that as center. All right, so what is normal is far to the right of what many of us would consider center. If you can't notice what's normal, if you can't notice what they're identifying as normal, you can't challenge it. And you can't, so you already are missing a perspective if you don't see what's being defined as normal. And let's just go to the fifth. What comparisons does the author set up? Are there any comparisons that are either similarities, analogies where you're saying this is like this, or positions that the author says and then says this is not that, or this is not like that? Riddle?
Well, the one negative they had is in response to the observation that there's no precedent, but nevertheless the opportunity might be lost.
Okay, so important to find those buts and howevers. Yeah, absolutely. All right, there's an opportunity. This was an opportunity, but now it's not. I would say that they don't use a lot of analogies, but some articles do. Now, I'm going to give you all of these other articles, but I want to ask where do you want to go next? Because we don't have naturally enough time. One direction that we can go is to look at the New York Times editorial inspired by the same event. Another direction we can go is that I also printed out copies of the Wall Street Journal news article about the event and the New York Times news article about the event, with the point, once we've looked at opinion, I think it's valuable to look at what claims not to be opinion. All right, and I love showing students news articles about the same event from different newspapers, because the news is completely different. What the event was is a completely different thing. I think it would be valuable for us to look at a news article. I'm inclined to want to look at the New York Times news article because it's always hardest to find assumptions when the assumptions are things that we might agree with. So, shall we do that? Ridula?
Just that point, last semester was teaching a media ethics class, and we did searches on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, and I think it was really startling how coverage about police aggression on young black males was almost absent from Fox News searches. And then we looked at shootings that, so there was, the one particular incident was the young man Dylan Roof, who killed about 9 African-American members of a church. And we did just keyword searches in CNN versus Fox News. And there is, for example, if you typed in keyword searches of African-American, killings of African-Americans in, I think it was Virginia, there's nothing that comes up on Fox News. And if you typed in Dylan Roof, there's an article that comes up that like 1 or 2 articles, but that don't really sort of, they're not the key articles.
Right.
You do the same thing on a CNN archive and you get all of the coverage that you might expect. And so that was really startling about how they curate their news and make it available should you look at it. So it's besides the point,
But it also is the point.
It is the point.
It's, you know, take a look at this New York Times article.
Look at the title of this.
Now, remember, this is a news article. So again, the question to think about is, the questions to think about are all the ones on this critical note-taking. What does the author identify as the issue or the event? What does the author highlight as valuable? Because all of that still happens. All right, so what's at issue? What's the event in the New York Times article? What's at issue? If you take a look at the title and you take a look at the first paragraph.
Unions, teachers, foundational judgments.
Okay. Ridula?
it's that the unions have won a temporary victory.
Mm-hmm. So notice that where the Wall Street Journal opinion piece, what was at issue was freedom of speech and the Supreme Court. In this, what is at issue is the victory of the unions. Now, of course, it's, you know, this is the news article rather than the opinion piece, but
it's interesting how the page, they go into detail about the strategy.
Right. And this is, you know, I mean, we all know about news articles, right? They start with a broad overview and they go more and more into detail as you go further into the news article. What do these authors, or what does this author, Liptak, highlight as valuable? What are the values that he highlights, either explicitly or implicitly, right?
Well, he asked for input from an expert, the clinical scientist who's mentioned at the bottom of the first page.
Okay, but we're not there yet. That's
Oh,
whose
sure.
perspectives matter. I'm asking about values. What values are named as important? Are unions valuable, or is collective bargaining valuable? Randall?
I think fairness
Okay.
is a value, because
And where do you see that?
the article takes pains to distinguish between money spent on political activity and money spent for collective bargaining,
Okay.
and seems to articulate that the issue is really that money spent on collective bargaining should be shared by all.
Where do you see that?
because, for that would be, on the second page, toward
Mhm.
the end, the fourth full paragraph from the bottom. Forcing non-members to pay for unions' political activities violated the First Amendment, the court said in Abu versus Detroit Board of Education. But it was constitutional, the court added, to require non-members to help pay for unions' collective bargaining efforts.
Prevent freeloading. All right, freeloading is one of those implicit loaded language that suggests that value of fairness, right?
I think representation for those who don't have power. So, you know, the sentence that union officials said they were elated by Tuesday's decision, but they remain wary of future efforts to diminish their effectiveness, so that efficacy for people to have a voice.
Okay. Right?
Similarly, the first sentence in the editorial mentions forcing public employees to pay agency quote fees, whereas the New York Times article that we're looking at now mentions not wanting to pay for the union's collective bargaining activities, so the language is much different there.
Yeah.
The choice of the quote, we know, to quote American Henry,
Uh-huh.
we know the wealthy extremists have been involved, which this case deliberately what's happened was there are 30 nights and strict opportunities for unions, so there's enough, again, assumptions to who the unions are defending.
Yeah.
And that's purposefully included.
And also in support of Mridula's point is the third paragraph on the first page, the last sentence. Those who simply choose not to join while benefiting from the union's efforts on their behalf. Hey, so how about whose perspectives matter? And this is really interesting because what you'll notice if you go through is that the New York Times cites both sides.
Yeah, I noticed that. I saw that. Union perspective.
Are they equal? Are both perspectives equally valued? Angela, how do you see that they're not?
They take care every time they cite the other side to identify that it's a libertarian group. And I think that itself, while not a loaded word, is a buzzword for readers of the New York Times. That frames the opinion right away in somewhat emotive terms.
Right?
I think that there's a lot of power in the final word, which the journalist gives to the CTA and the call to appoint the nomination that President Obama's put forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they've got Fader, Ginsburg, Breyer, Sittemore, Hagan, right at the beginning.
They only list their names as opposed to
Yeah.
everyone on the, everyone
On
only
the
listed
right.
the conservative.
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting.
And so this is part of what's interesting about using news articles. And again, this is it's a step in the scaffolding, all right? Because where we really want students to be able to distinguish, to be able to pull out values, et cetera, is in much more complex text. But news articles are relatively easy to read, and so, but we move from things that are overtly opinionated, editorials, to things that are implicitly opinionated, like news articles. So if you were to go on the Opinionaire, Lip Pack is the last one. Where would you put his opinions? Does he agree or disagree that collective action inhibits individual freedom? You think you would disagree? What's your evidence?
I don't think he takes a position on it. I think he seems to suggest that curtailing the freedom in this case is legitimate on fairness grounds.
That's a great point, because the question about, you can say, yes, it does curtail individual freedom, and that's a good thing. So partly that the asking students to make a judgment on what he says about this is a red herring, because he might agree and think it's appropriate, think it's a legitimate point. And that's one of the things that comes out when you start to talk about assumptions, is that assumptions and values are tied up together, right? You can assume something, you can both assume the same thing and attach different value judgments to it. How about all who benefit from an activity should pay for it? He's explicit about that, right? He's explicit that he agrees about that. The choice of how to spend one's money is a free speech issue. You see how you have to be very careful about how you design these statements, because they evoke interesting questions when you try to answer them about any of the articles that you're reading. Given time, I'm going to move us on. I hope that you see how that's a logical step in the scaffolding. I want to introduce you to another tool to help students think about assumptions. I'm sorry there are so many handouts. And I will send you all of these electronically.
No wonder they apologize for giving us handouts.
I'm sorry?
We don't apologize for giving us handouts. It's very nice of you.
So this is another version of the Opinionaire. And what this version does is it uses scenarios and asks students to make judgments based on scenarios, and then to talk about it and to engage in group discussions about that. And what happens when they do that is that they start to surface some of their own assumptions, but also think about the procedures that they use to define criteria. So this one is about courage. But you could do it about all kinds of things. You know, you could do it given these articles, you could do it about freedom. You know, is this person free or not free? And that's not so much about uncovering other people's assumptions as it is about uncovering your own. Another tool to think about assumptions. And I'm going through these fairly quickly because there's one more activity that I want to do with you, is the cultural eye. And the notion of the cultural eye is that we are all defined by our experiences and the groups to which we belong and personal characteristics, etc. And each of these areas of our lives shape how we see the world. So each of these lines represents a lens through which we see the world. So there are ways in which I see the world as a man that would be very different if I saw the world as a woman or as a transgender person, since I'm cisgender. So the idea of this is you can have students do this for themselves and think about the ways in which their various lenses shape the way they see the world. But then you can also have them do it for authors and ask, well, what in this piece seems to come out of, what lenses does this author seem to be applying? What position, what social position does the author appear to be taking in this piece? Or what social positions are shaping the author's perspective?
Something interesting about this was the other night when I was working with students who were trying to take CBS, and I had a topic, and it was about whether or not students should work in high school. And immediately one young woman said, well, in my culture, it's assumed that you will work, but then I can't write about that on the CBS. I said, why not? And you explain it to the audience. Okay, again, so she was shifting her approach to her assumption that the audience would reject it, rather than thinking about how can I argue this and explain it to the audience.
Yeah.
I said that would make for a more complex paper, and you'd probably do quite well. So this is an interesting exercise for having this kind of conversation.
And you'll notice that one of these is blank and the other one has some suggestions. You can use whichever. What I like about the blank one is that we get to self-define what are the aspects that shape how we see the world. And someone pointed out the last time I used one of these in a workshop, it changes in terms of which ones are important. There are contexts in which it is more or less important that I'm white. There are contexts in which it's more or less important that I'm male. And so thinking about that and the way that you can revise this for different contexts can be interesting. And finally, and this is one I'm going to ask you to do, even though we're almost out of time. Here you have some pieces of made-up data and their consequences, and 4 questions. The questions are, what conclusions do you draw from these findings? Justify your answers by referring to the data. That's an overall question. The 3 questions I want you to answer are, is the new curriculum beneficial? How do you know? Is the teacher aid beneficial? How do you know? Is the reduced class size beneficial? How do you know? So just take a few minutes to look over those data and draw your conclusions. Again, in the interest of time, is the new curriculum beneficial? Yes or no? How many of you say yes? How many say no? You have to have an answer.
I say we don't know.
You say you don't know, that you do know. For all of these, you can answer yes or no. So for those who said yes, why do you say yes?
Because in each situation where they had the new curriculum, there was improvement.
Okay?
It seems like the greater issue is having that teacher aid.
Well, so let's ask, is having a teacher aide beneficial?
Yes.
Yes, there was only one control study though.
There's only one where it's just the teacher aide and that has improvement.
But any of the others that had a teacher's aide all show improvement.
Right,
Yes.
but you can't differentiate.
Right.
Exactly. So it's not-
Well,
But you did go
the
from
new curriculum and
improvement-
teacher aide
Yeah,
was
you went-
greatly improved.
Yeah, you went from improvement to great.
The implication is there, but the proof is,
Yeah.
unless they separated, unless
Well,
they ask distinct questions about the teacher's aide.
But if you think about it as improvement is +1,
I know.
greatly improvement is +2, then there's teacher
Teacher's
aide
aide
and new
outweighs
curriculum.
new curriculum.
They're both, so it's +2. So they, and again, it's very simple in terms of data, but how about reduced class size? Is that beneficial? How many said yes? How many said no?
Well, we don't know.
Well, according to these data, you do know.
Because it's grouped.
Merdula?
So I think in every situation where it's improved, where there is an improvement, reduced class size is paired with something else which independently has been shown to produce improvement.
Improvement. Which says,
That it's not reduced class sizes, that
Right.
they're at best neutral.
right,
So if we see curriculum's value added to the teacher aid result, then, you know, we didn't get the great improvement with new curriculum and reduced class size. So,
right. The reason for this activity is that most of us assume reduced class size.
I was gonna say from outside
Right.
information, I believe.
Right. And what that does is it interferes with our ability to interpret the data. And so this is an activity to use, or something similar, in which students are going to have outside assumptions, is the kind of activity to use to help students understand that their assumptions can prevent them from seeing. We are almost out of time, and so I just want to ask, what will you do with this? I mean, do you have things that you can take forward and do something with?
I have a book that I have students read, and it's about personal greatness, and basically it's about personal responsibility. And so I have them read it, and I have them write a 2-page paper, reflective paper, and I have a couple questions that they're supposed to answer. The choices they made, they got them referred to student conduct, what the book's saying, and how do those intersect. And then there's 4 other questions. I need to go back now and look at my questionnaire and look at what is really good critical thinking, and do I need to do scaffolding, do I need to rewrite my questions, do I need to, it gives me a lens in which to really look at what I'm trying to use as an educational experience for students referred.
Yeah,
Am I best doing that?
and I think that for those students in particular, that cultural eye could be really valuable, to help them see the ways in which they are seeing experiences,
Right.
and the ways in which other people are seeing
Right.
those
Right.
same experiences,
Right.
right?
So in the last semester or so, I've been creating some activities that ask students to engage with how authority is constructed and contextual, and this is very related. And what I've been doing was more so comparing and contrasting different types of information. And I think that within the times in which I have more time to do an instruction session, specifically looking at that comparison and contrast process that we did today with some of those specific questions, which are better honed than those that I were using, could be pretty helpful.
I think this is directly applicable for me because I teach the cooperative argumentation class, and what it helps me with is I usually come into class with the idea and expectation that I will get my students to think like this, but it's very hard when you frame questions without scaffolding, as you said. So my experience has been, I'll come in with something that I'm really excited about, and then they're just not going where I want them to go, and then usually I just kind of feel helpless about it, and I end up taking over, which is not what I want to have happen. I want them to struggle through it, and I think this is a good way of helping them along, to help them focus on what I would do, I guess, implicitly.
And what you just said is really important, I think. We need to become aware of some of the processes we engage with implicitly and think about how to make those explicit for our students. And these kinds of worksheets are one way of doing it. Think alouds are another way of doing it. But we have learned somehow, through our experience, to struggle successfully. And for many of our students, we need to show them how. Because they, for whatever reason, they haven't learned those procedures, and it's the procedures they need.
I think this would be a really good starting point. I like the idea, the prospective activity and the cultural I know I'm going to use them. I've done it in the past, brought in 2 newspapers from 2 viewpoints, but the idea of editorials plus newspapers I hadn't thought of, and I just think it's a really great activity to make things explicit. But imagine beginning with the cultural I and giving the student the understanding that they too, while they can see their own bias or their own preferences, but then to go one step further, now let's compare how our cultural eyes, what's different about my perspective and your perspective, and then take them into these types of readings. I think it's just a really great foundational intro piece. And I teach cooperative argumentation too. I can see it being really helpful.
And I think one of the things to help students see is that while they can label some of the things on their cultural eye, what is really significant is what are the things they don't even think to label.
That's when you can have them turn it over, and say, now here are some, or add to their list,
Oh, I was just going to say that the dialogue that we're having, that I'm trying to help students engage in, is something where the goal, it's already explicitly stated that the goal is to understand one another. That we are all winning here. This is a successful activity if at the end you feel that you understand one another, not that one side feels that they've won and the other side is not. So I think that. And one of the things that we've talked about is that if you are simply formulating your next argument while someone else is speaking, then you're missing the point. So I think that giving them something to do with that time while they're listening, so that they can actually, to help them do that thing of understanding, I think will be very productive.
And help them listen closely.
Help them listen closely.
But one of the things that happened with you earlier that I think is something important to pick up is where people might agree on their assumptions and agree for different reasons, and how to tease that out. And even the fact that those agreements on assumptions can be a place from which to build discussion. And so I love that moment when you said, oh wait, I completely disagree with this article, but I agree with some of the assumptions. And I thought that was really that was an important moment. Undine, how about you?
I was seeing two things I could do. I mean, one was, so I've been teaching the service learning class for the first time, and I decided to kind of blend low-tech and high-tech. So the low-tech was I would maybe get composition journals and advance them into journal, and I'm only collecting them twice during the semester, once at midterm and once at final. And so I collected the midterm, and I was thinking I would have them code their experiences in the classroom, but I found, and this is I'm just learning, that, you know, students start their service learning at different points. So some had almost finished and were very procedural in their, what they wrote down, but without really describing what was happening in the classroom. And so really there's no data for them to work with. And I thought, well, that's not going to work. And this person's already done, and they're way ahead, and I'm not going to cause a huge rift by saying, well, now you need to go back and reflect, because it wouldn't work. And on the other side of that, I'm noticing that I had given them a memo to write about their own academic experience, and to go online and look up, you know, what were the relative percentages of free and reduced lunch or gender pay poverty in their community or not, and think about, you know, the level of privilege that they had in their academic experience as compared to some of the things we've been reading about in the class. And again, it just seemed to go over some students' heads. So I'm thinking the cultural eye piece would be a really nice piece to bring, and then have the students fill it out and then have a discussion about it. And then, because then I had said their second memo that they wrote me was kind of doing the same thing, but describing the school and the community that they're working in, and then to look at the community from the economic perspective, the median cost of home, you know, all of these, you know, what are the indicators of relative poverty that create an inequitable academic experience. So I'm thinking that the cultural eye piece might be a really nice way, because of what I want them to do, and this is how I've changed the project, is for their culminating final project that we will present to each other in groups, is to write a piece where they're actually comparing and contrasting their experience with the experience they see in the school, and then zero in on some kind of lesson, and read about California standards and, you know, what's the and the Common Core, actually, the new Common Core, and then what's the expectation around that specific lesson. Just, you know, looking at what they saw happening in the class with where Common Core wants them to go, and getting them to pull all the pieces. You know, maybe I'm thinking too big, but I think the cultural lens piece will be nice, because I'm thinking it's going to add another layer to how they, you know, put that final piece together. And then the flip side was, I'm thinking some of the opinionaire might be a really nice way of having them read the sample papers I give them, for sample critical analysis papers I give them. Not that they're perfect papers, but to look for inherent bias in people's arguments.
Sure.
So that's my other way.
Thanks, and thank you all.